In today's tutorial, we're going to paint some dainty wildflowers using loose watercolor techniques, and we're also going to practice painting a backside perspective of a flower to add some variation to your composition. I'll explain everything step by step in real time so you can follow along easily. Let's get started. All the supplies I'm using in this video are linked down below in the description box, so be sure to check that out if you want to see exactly what paint, brushes, and paper I'm using throughout this video. So the first thing I did was I just took a pencil and sketched out some very basic stems. You don't have to do this part, but anytime I paint bouquets of any sort, I like to just pencil in where those primary stems are going to go, and then you can always add more or erase it if you don't like it. But you can see I added one main stem and then a few overlapping ones. That's what I'll start with. And I want to have my primary flowers be right here in the center. So I'm going to start with this one on the left, and I'll just do a very basic flower. I loaded up some of my light pink mixture. Again, all these colors are linked down below if you're curious what mixtures I'm using. But I'm just going to start by placing down some dots. It's the same technique that I do in a lot of my floral tutorials. I'll link one of them up here at the top. But I start with the dots just like that, and then I rinse off my brush and pull out some petals. So I'm just using clean water in my brush. And when I pull out these petals, I'm not worrying about making them perfect. I'm just pulling out some color, laying my brush down. You can see those bristles just expand and create simple little petals. And I want them all to look slightly different. So I'm really just letting my brush create unique shapes. And while that's still wet, I'm going to drop in some darker pigment back into the center. You can see since we pulled out that color, it's much lighter than it originally was. So I'm just going to gently tap some of that back in. And we will add some more detail to that once it dries later on. But for now, we'll leave it as is. And now let's go ahead and add our second primary flower. This one's going to be a similar pink, but much darker. So I'm using my permanent alizarin crimson, and I'm going to do this one quite a bit higher. It'll be the tallest of all the wildflowers. And I'm going to add the dots just like I did for the first flower, but they're going to be a little bit more horizontal. They're a little more of an oval shape than a circle shape. And I'll rinse off my brush once again so you have clean bristles. And then you can start pulling that color out and creating your flower petals. You can see, again, I'm just pulling out that color from the center and letting my brush create these interesting shapes. Rinsing off my brush every so often so I have clean water to work with. And continuing to add some petals. And I'm going to make this last petal kind of horizontal to give a slightly different perspective. And there is our second flower. So you can see you're getting these really cool petal shapes just by being loose and letting your brush make these strokes. So I'm not perfectly pulling out each and every petal like I've done in some of my other tutorials. For these wildflowers, I really want them to have that expressive and fun look. So you're getting kind of these jaggedy edges just by letting your brush create those kind of random strokes. Now this one is quite a bit lighter, so I'm going to go over it with one more layer, just in a couple areas to darken some of that. And the first layer is still a little wet, so you'll see some slight bleeding, but I'll need to blend it out too. So I don't want to have any harsh edges when it dries, so I'm just going to use a clean brush here to blend it out and soften some of those edges. And now let's go ahead and add some filler flowers, which I love to do. I'm going to be using this light blue mixture of Prussian blue and titanium white. And I'm going to make them kind of like a lavender stem. I'll bring you in a bit closer so you can see it better. Like I said, it's going to be kind of similar to lavender, but I'm just going to start with a super light value. It's very watered down. And I'm just barely tapping my brush down on the paper to create these unique little brush marks. And we'll go over this with a second layer, so don't worry if it's looking very light right now. And like I said, my sketches are not set in stone, so I don't have to follow this exactly. I'm going to add another little one coming off the side here, just to make the bouquet a little more full, but I'll do the same process. So starting with this light value and just gently tapping my brush down. I'm not filling it in so it's a big blob of color. I'm just creating these unique little shapes for this first layer. And that way, they're still wet when I tap in my darker value here. For the second layer, it's the same color but slightly more pigmented. And because that first layer is still wet, the color is mixing really nicely and creating these organic blooms. And this is one of my personal favorite ways to paint filler flowers because you can't really control it. It just creates its own really pretty, unique blooms. So just tapping on that second layer, and you're always working light to dark with watercolor. You can add as many layers as you want, darker and darker, but you can't necessarily go the other way. Now I want to create some balance, so I'm going to do another one of these little blue stems, but just a tiny little guy over on the right side. So this one will be much smaller, starting with that light value and just gently tapping in this first layer. I'm giving it a bit of movement. I don't want any of the elements to be sticking straight out, and going in with my darker value on top. Now I want to add another flower here, but this time I'm going to do kind of a backside view. So you're going to just see the very back attachment of this flower. So I'm just creating this kind of V or U shape with my pencil. Again, I'm not a big fan of sketching, but I do just like to make little shapes like this in my sketches sometimes to help me figure out the perspective. And I'm going to use the same permanent alizarin crimson. It's the same color I used for that very top flower. And remember, this is the attachment that we just sketched in. So we'll be actually painting that in, the green part of the stem, later in the video. But for now, I'm just going to pretend that that's there. I'm going to load up my pink, and I'm just going to start creating these little wispy petals coming up out of that attachment. So you're just creating these little wispy marks, and again, this is where it's attaching. You're not going to see all the petals going around because some of them will be on the other side. It's kind of hard to explain, but it'll make more sense and come together once we add the stem. So for now, I'm just creating these wispy little petals going upward. And you can see that I also overlapped the stem on the left a little bit. That's something that I love to do when I paint bouquets, to give it a little more depth and to show that some flowers are overlapping the others. So you can also see these really pretty blooms start to form when I tap in some of that darker color on the inside. Again, you are not trying to create perfect petal shapes here. You're just painting these wild little wispy petals. And again, it's a little hard to visualize. It looks kind of crazy at this stage, but once we add this stem and attachment, it'll all come together. So just the final step here, I'm tapping in one more little layer of the very dark pigment in the very center to make that contrast even more bold. And a reminder that your colors always dry quite a bit lighter. So you can see we've lost a little bit of that dark value of blue. So I'm going to go back now that it's dry and tap in one final layer of blue on top. Now, since it's dry, you're not going to get the bleeding like we did earlier, but you will get that nice sharp contrast there. Again, I'm not making perfect little dots. I'm just applying different amounts of pressure and letting the tip of the brush make contact with the paper. So let's add a few more flowers here, and I think a nice color to balance all of this would be a bit of my cadmium yellow deep. I love mixing this color into pink bouquets. So I'm going to use my pencil and just add a few more little stems here for where I want those buds to be. Feel free to put them wherever you'd like. And I like to paint my buds. If you've taken some of my other tutorials, you'll recognize this technique, but I start with making a little U shape with very pigmented mixture of the color. Just like that. That's going to be the base of the bud. And then I use clean bristles, so I rinse off my brush, tap off excess water, and start to smooth that upwards. So you have a nice gradient from the light value at the top of the bud to the darker value at the base. You can lift some additional color if you want to make it even more of a light highlight. And then you can always tap in some more pigment at the bottom if you want to create that nice gradient. And I'll do the same thing and add one more on the other side. I never want my bouquets to be perfectly symmetrical, but I do want to have balance. So I have two little yellow buds on the right side. Let's do one on this side. And yeah, let's put it right about here. Once again, starting heavily pigmented and making a little U shape for the base of the bud, rinsing off my brush, tapping off any excess water on my paper towel, and then gently blending that up to get that soft gradient from dark value at the base to light value at the top. And I like to just tap in some more pigment at the bottom as it dries to deepen that value a bit. And there we have our buds. So now let's start adding in the stems. I'm going to go back in and add more detail to those top flowers later, but for now I just want to at least block in the stems. So using the same brush, I've used the same size 5 Princeton brush for the entire painting. And I'm going to start with a fairly light value because again, I always want to work light to dark with watercolors. So a lighter value just means it's more watered down. It's not as heavily pigmented or concentrated. And I'm just going to gently fill in some of these stems. Now, if you also sketched out your stems, you might want to slightly erase before you start painting. I left mine darker so you can see it on camera a bit better. But once you put a layer of paint on top of pencil, you're not able to erase it. So if you are painting with a light value of green, you might see some pencil marks underneath unless you erase it a little bit before you start painting. But I'm just using the tip of my brush here to create these dainty little stems. And you can see this flower is overlapping that stem. So I left a bit of a gap here and then I'll continue on. Same thing here, just connecting some of these elements. And we can always go back in and add more to it as we go, but for now I just want to block in those stems, make sure I like the overall composition. And once you get to this part, this is what I was mentioning, it's a little tricky to visualize because it looks kind of wonky at this point. But I'm going to use that same green and just fill in that color. I'm getting a little bit of that pink bleeding into it, so just make sure your flower petals are dry. And you just want to indicate that this is the back of the flower and that the center of the flower, the stamen that you can see on these two, is actually facing the opposite way. So this is the back end of the flower that you're painting. And so it just adds a nice variety of perspective so that not all your stems and all your flowers are perfectly facing the same direction. It just gives it some nice variety. So just tapping in some more color here. And I'll make the stem slightly darker too. So now can you visualize it a little better? As I said, it's kind of hard to visualize, especially if you're not used to painting in different perspectives. I still struggle with perspectives quite a bit, but this is just a fun way to add kind of a flower that's pointing away from you. If you're holding this bouquet, these flowers are pointing towards you, and then this one's pointing away. It's just a fun little change in perspective. And now this part, I really encourage you to make some of your own creative choices here, because all we're going to be doing is adding in some leaves and additional greenery. So I never really sketch out or plan out where I want my leaves to go. I just kind of pick and choose. I push my brush down and lift back up and create these simple little leaves, just like this. And again, I don't really plan out where I want each of them to go. I just kind of feel it out. And you don't want all your leaves to look the same. You also don't want any of them sticking straight out. You can see all the ones I've added so far have a little bit of curve to it to give the piece some more movement. So I'm just gonna do this first layer, again, still using a fairly light value of green and blocking in those stems and leaves. And you don't want to go overboard here because what we're going for here is a dainty wildflower bouquet. If you go too crazy and add a bunch of elements, it might look maybe like a bridal bouquet or one that you would find at a florist shop. But I want this piece to just look like I was out in the mountains and plucked some wildflowers and put together this little funky bouquet. So I don't want to go overboard, but I do want to darken some of these pieces. It's the same color, but just a darker, more concentrated value. So having some differences in values like this will really help to add depth to your bouquet. You don't want it to look flat. You don't want it to look like all the stems are on the same level. You want it to look like some of them are in front of the other. And by having some of them that are lighter and some that are darker, it really helps you achieve that depth. You can also add some little wispy strokes like this. If you've watched my other tutorials, you know how much I love adding little embellishments like this and just kind of filling in that bouquet a little bit more. I also like to sometimes add a little bit more of a base to these little buds. You can see it looks a little more connected now. And at this stage, again, I don't want to go overboard, so you don't want to add anything too crazy, but I do want to add a little bit more to this flower. So I'm going to actually take a little bit of carbon black, and I'll use the very tip of my brush and tap in a tiny bit of texture here for this stamen. I don't want it to turn into a black blob, but I do want to deepen it a bit. So using the very tip of my brush and creating some tiny little dots. And I'll do the same thing on the flower to the right just to tie it all together. I'm also going to add a little more pigment here just to darken this flower a little bit. It's so much lighter than the other ones. So I'm just going to deepen that a little bit more, taking my clean brush and blending out that color. And because these are wildflowers, you can really take risks and do crazy strokes and experiment with new things, because I don't even have specific flowers in mind when I'm painting ones like this. I just want them to look like something you would find if you were hiking on the side of the mountain. So it does not have to be perfect, but I'm just adding a little bit of texture here and the final little details. I'm going to add a little bit of raw umber to my mixture here to desaturate it a bit and deepen a few more little leaves and a few stems. Again, I don't want to go too deep because I do really like the light, vibrant feel of this painting, but just adding one final layer of deep dark green. Another thing you can do if you'd like is add a couple of leaves coming out of these flowers. So these top flowers just look like they're kind of hanging out there, but you can always add a couple of little leaves coming out of those flowers off the top or off the side. Again, I don't want it to be too overwhelming, but just adding a little more here to make those top flowers look more like a part of this bouquet and a little more embellished. There you have it. Remember, you can always make variations to this painting by switching up your color palette, the types of flowers you paint, and the arrangement of them all. But this is a really good starting point for a basic wildflower bouquet. If you want to learn more, be sure to check out the rest of my floral tutorials here on my channel, and I will see you in the next video.